David Sanger takes a behind-the-scenes look at President Obama's use of American power. Mr. Sanger talks about his book, Confront and Conceal, now on Book TV.
Than anything else. I started this book because some of you may have seen a book called The Inheritance that came out just 2 weeks before President Obama took office. And that was a book about the enormous foreign policy agenda that he was left with. And it was not a book about Iraq. I had decided that there were so many books about Iraq written about the Bush presidency that we really needed to write something about what happened while we were off fighting a war that I think many here could argue was the right war or the wrong war, but certainly was a war that ended up taking a whole lot longer than anybody thought and sucked a huge amount of the intellectual capital of Washington out while it was being pursued, and led to all kinds of issues that we are now facing in Afghanistan, now facing in China, now facing throughout the Middle East. And the book raised so many questions that my editors at Random House sort of came back to me and said, okay, so you've written a nice intro, but it would be sort of interesting to see how President Obama dealt with this. Actually, at the time that they were signing all of this up, we were in the middle of a financial crisis. It wasn't clear the degree to which President Obama was going to get to turn to these foreign policy issues at all. But I started collecting string along the way while I was doing my normal reporting. And of course, a book like this takes on a very different hue as time goes on. For example, there are 4 chapters in this book about the Arab Spring. But if you looked at the proposal for the book as written in 2009, there is no mention of the Arab Spring, because I was as tuned out as many others in Washington was to the possibility that this would happen at this speed, and that it would have the kind of backlash that we've now seen as well. I knew that Iran was going to be a big issue. I knew that China was going to be a big issue, and what I wanted to do was try to compare not only how President Obama differed in his policies from President Bush, that's the sort of easy essay, but whether or not the country came to conceive of these problems in a different way. And I think that it's fair to say that 3.5 years into this, the country does think in different terms. I mean, President Obama came to office after a decade in which threats to the United States had dominated Washington's view of the world. In fact, I think you could argue that combating the threats had become the dominant theme of American foreign policy, and it had distorted almost all of our grander goals, and it had preoccupied our leaders, and it had blinded us to many greater opportunities. And so part of the trick for President Obama was to see if he could lift the country out of its defensive crouch. But the other part was to see whether he could find a different way, not only a different way from President Bush, but a different way from what he had described during the campaign. Let me take you back to that campaign, since we're in the midst of another one. It's a little hard to remember. But you had President Obama vowing engagement, and you had a lot of people saying that engagement with America's adversaries was a naive thought. And those people were not just his Republican adversaries. It was, for example, his future Secretary of State, who's had to go out and now implement the very policy that she went out and criticized during that time. And she actually has the good sense of humor, at least in the interviews I did with her for this book, to laugh about that today. But the surprise of the Obama presidency, I think, is that both the left and the right feels today that they didn't get what they thought they were buying. So on the left, you know, his supporters saw this very welcome turn away from the black and whites of the Bush years, and they got that. But they also thought they were getting a turn away from American unilateralism, and they didn't always get that. On the right, his critics saw naivete and softness, whenever you heard that phrase that he was a community organizer in Chicago, it wasn't necessarily meant as a knock on Chicago, but it was certainly meant as a knock on the thought that somebody who's been a community organizer could also be a commander-in-chief. And so the surprise they've gotten on the right has been the degree of aggressiveness that this administration has had, not only in pursuing things like the bin Laden raid, which I think probably whoever was president faced with that kind of intelligence would have found a way to get at bin Laden, but that you have seen an extraordinarily aggressive, if somewhat secret, approach to the use of American power to back up and force that engagement, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. And so the book tries to examine the question, is there an Obama doctrine that we can sort of discern from the way he has acted? And at the risk of, diminishing our sales at the end of the evening, I will just lay out for you what I think the doctrine is, and then we can debate about how new it is or not. Faced with direct threats to the U.S., I think it's pretty clear that President Obama is perfectly willing to use unilateral action, maybe even more willing than President Bush was in some cases. So the bin Laden raid is an easy example, but also one he telegraphed during the campaign. But think about the increasing drone strikes, not only in Pakistan, but across in Yemen and many other places, where this administration has built a legal rationale to step up those strikes and rely on the drones much more dramatically than President Bush did. President Bush, I think, had about 48, 49 drone strikes during his entire presidency in Pakistan. The last I looked, which was just as Confront and Conceal was being published a few weeks ago, the Obama administration had passed 250 between Pakistan, Yemen, and a few of those others, and had begun to talk about it some. The other side, the one even less talked about than drones, and the side that I've written about here and that has raised many of those hornets that Marshall spoke about, is an increasing reliance on cyber weapons. Now, cyber weapons don't always fit the bill. You may remember that during the Libya invasion, there was a proposal to President Obama, which we wrote about in the paper, to come and take out Libya's air defenses using a cyber weapon, until some aides came to the president and explained to him that Libya was so disconnected from the internet, it wasn't clear that this was going to go work. So they went out and did it the old-fashioned way. They bombed it, okay? But there are moments when they can work. And Operation Olympic Games, which I describe in some detail at both the beginning of the book and in a chapter by that name, was the first sustained use of a cyber weapon by the United States against another state. And it's a fairly significant issue, not only for the revelation of it, I think, but because we're just at that moment, as we were with drones 10 years ago, where we have to begin to think about when and how we want to go use cyber weapons, because we are, as you all know, the most vulnerable country on earth to the use of cyber weapons against us. In fact, it was just a year ago that the Pentagon came out, little less than a year ago, and said that if there's an attack, a cyber attack on American infrastructure, it would be regarded as an act of war against the United States. And the Obama administration has, I think, quite commendably done a huge amount to try to build up America's defenses against cyber attack. And it's a hard issue because the attackers may not be states. They may well be ingenious hackers. They may be members of organized crime. They may be people that states hire and hide behind. But it changes the complexion of that problem if the United States itself has chosen, even in a covert program, to get out and make use of this weapon and be the first state to sort of make use of it over a very sustained period of time, and a different kind of use than what we see so often from China and Russia, which is just coming into American computers, trying to scoop up huge amounts of data, watch how those computers are used. But Olympic Games was quite different. Olympic Games was instead an attack on another state's computer systems, not to get at the computers, but to go through the computers and try to destroy a significant piece of infrastructure. In this case, it was the centrifuges that enrich uranium for Iran, but the controllers that they were attacked are the same kind of controllers that are used in chemical plants, in many electrical production plants. So if this becomes a significant form of warfare, it is, or even of covert action, it's something that can, turn off the lights in Chicago or bring down the cell phone network. There are all kinds of different ways that one can use attacks on infrastructure using cyber means. And we're at the very beginning stages of understanding this. We're sort of where we were in understanding the use of atomic weapons between 1945 and 1949, when we knew that the Soviets and ultimately others would get the same weapon, but we had this big lead and we weren't quite sure how we were going to set the rules. And when you think about it, it took us 20 years to figure out how we were going to use nuclear weapons, or more precisely to figure out how we were not going to use them. Because you may remember that MacArthur tried to get authorization to use them in Korea. That was when Marshall was just starting the Chicago Council time, I'm sure. Then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is 50 years ago this October, there were proposals put forward to President Kennedy to simply solve this problem with the Russians or the Soviets at that time once and for all. And it was really only after the Cuban Missile Crisis was over and after Kennedy had decided that there had to be another alternative that we decided, A, the weapons were too powerful to use, and B, you would only use them then in a moment of great national survival or to deter attacks of a more conventional kind. Now with drones, we've made the other decision, that rather than a weapon of mass destruction, drones are a very precise weapon that you can target pretty carefully. Some people say not carefully enough. And so we're using them every week. And cyber, I suspect, is going to fall somewhere in between. But we're nowhere near understanding how we're going to go use them. And so it's particularly interesting to think that in the days just before President Obama took the oath of office, he went over to see President Bush in the White House for just a one-on-one meeting. And President Bush said to him, there are two programs that, trust me, you are not going to want to give up on. And one of them is drones, and the other is Olympic Games. And turned out, President Obama not only didn't give up on them, he used them as the basis for the light footprint strategy. And the light footprint strategy is essentially a strategy that says we can no longer afford to send 100,000 troops and spend $1 billion and occupy countries for 5 or 6, or in Afghanistan's case now 11 years, and breed all the resentments that come from those kind of occupations, and then discover as we're leaving that we really hadn't changed the society as much as we had initially convinced ourselves we were going to. So he needed a different approach. And as Marshall suggested, that approach has been to try to make use of American technology and new weapons that would enable the U.S. to get in and get out and not have an occupying force. Drones are a big part of that. Cyber is a big part of that. And special forces, the fastest growing part of the U.S. military, is a big part of that because they can go in and do a precision job. You saw one on the night of the bin Laden raid. But as the Special Forces commanders will point out to you when you ask, there were 14 different raids that night. You only read about one of them. But 14 is about a standard number for most evenings in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's pretty remarkable. So you've seen the president embrace this new approach. What have the effects been? Well, let's start in Afghanistan. He decided to make use of the light footprint in Afghanistan after a year of phenomenal education in 2009 about the limits of the heavy footprint. So you've all know well the story of the president's big public decisions to go ahead with the surge in Afghanistan, the addition of 33,000 troops. It came after a very lengthy process in which he had 8 or 9 meetings of the National Security Council, which means that there were probably 80 or 90 meetings of the deputies to prepare for that, and who knows how many meetings of the staff below that to prepare for those. And everybody in the U.S. government had a say in this. They would beam in the generals in the field. They would bring in experts on Pakistani nuclear weapons. They would bring in economic experts about what the effects would be if the U.S. surged on the Afghan economy and what the effects would be as we left. And we're about to go discover that experiment. Of course, because you have that many people in the meeting, and because you're releasing photographs of everybody in that meeting, it's not terribly hard for people who do for a living what I do and my colleagues at the Times do to have written accounts of each one of those meetings that weren't just the authorized, they met and duly considered the issue kind of accounts. And by about the 4th or 5th meeting, the president was railing against leaks. Now, you have meetings that big, I don't know what he expected, but that's what happened. And I described this in the book, and the railing made a big effect. I would say we went 2-3 days before we actually learned much more about what happened in the next set of meetings. He did the surge, but he was nervous about it from the start. And so he set this very public deadline that starting 18 months out from the surge, he would begin to recover the surge. And what was fascinating as I went back to reconstruct the story of this was to learn how different the perceptions were between the people in the White House and around President Obama and the commanders in the field who believed that they could take the surge and forget about the 18-month deadline. That if they were being successful, certainly the president wouldn't turn off the surge. And if they were being unsuccessful, he was probably going to have to double down again. And there's a scene in the book where one of his advisors says to the president soon after his speech at West Point, "You know, sir, many of the commanders believe that they're going to get more time, so they're sort of ignoring the 18 months, which the president had them literally sign a piece of paper saying they understood this was for 18 months and then the withdrawal would begin. And the president looked at this official and said, you know, they're not getting more time. And they didn't. What happened was that about a year later, when the president had to begin to decide the timetable for withdrawal, there were no big National Security Council meetings. There were no photographs released. There were no leaks, or very few. There was a group of 5 or 6 people right around the president with whom he set the agenda, decided on the pace of withdrawal, brought in the Secretary of Defense, who was still Bob Gates, fairly late in the process, brought in Hillary Clinton fairly late in the process. General Petraeus, who was in his last days as the commander in Afghanistan, argued quite vociferously for keeping the surge in place to the end of 2012, the end of this year, before they fully recovered this extra 33,000. The president refused. And it was actually Gates who came up with the compromise, which was have all of the surge troops out by September of 2012, which for those of you who are doing the math in your head right now, yes, is about 60 days before the election. The president, I think, will be able to say in September that he's got 68,000 troops left in Afghanistan. That's twice as many as were there the day he was inaugurated, but that he is on his way down to a much smaller size. Now, to get to that size, he had to go dramatically narrow America's goals in Afghanistan. So if you listen to his speeches in 2009, you'll hear him talk, as President Bush did before that, about a war of necessity, about educating Afghan girls, about building schools, building civil society, making the population feel secure, classic counterinsurgency. And that is, in fact, what the initial military plan he was given would bring about, until he handed it off to the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who at the time was still Peter Orszag, and said, Peter, would you price this for me, sort of the way somebody goes and prices a piece of legislation? And he came back and he said, well, sir, it looks like this plan lasts for about 10 years, and numbers are rough, but assume about $1 trillion over 10 years. And if that number sounds roughly familiar, remember the health care bill was making its way through at the same time, that was roughly the estimate of what it would cost to insure every uninsured American for 10 years. So in an age of austerity, that was the choice. Try to rebuild Afghanistan with uncertain result, or spend the same amount of money insuring every uninsured American. And the last time I checked, the Afghans don't get to vote in the November election. But even if it had not been for that, I think that the president probably would have headed off in this very different direction. So then that left the question, how do you then deal with the problem? If you are not going to continue the kind of counterinsurgency that we talked about so much for 10 years before, including at some conferences out here in Chicago. And the answer came back that there had to be a way to beat back the threat without going into full-scale war. And that's when the president began to identify what he thought were his 3 big objectives in Afghanistan. And I'm going to tick them off for you, and you'll notice that 2 of them have nothing to do with Afghanistan. One, the one that does have something to do with Afghanistan, is keep the Taliban from retaking Kabul, basically knocking off the central government. The second was assure the security of Pakistani nuclear weapons. Those don't happen to be in Afghanistan. And the third was defeat and ultimately dismantle al-Qaeda, something that I think he's done with far more ferocity and success than any of us would have guessed 3.5 years ago. But al-Qaeda also wasn't in Afghanistan. And so when you hear about that enduring force that's going to remain in Afghanistan after 2014, it's worth thinking about these 3 objectives. It might be enough to keep a government together in Kabul, but its other objective is to stay behind the high walls of Bagram Air Force Base and a few others, and have a team ready if a Pakistani nuclear weapon went loose, and have a team ready if there were signs of a revival of al-Qaeda. And the Pakistani nuclear weapons going loose was an issue that really drove home to the White House, or was driven home to them, in the early summer of 2009. I described this in a chapter called The Bomb Scare, when for about 4 days, in total secrecy, this White House went into something of a near panic because they had picked up intercepts suggesting that the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, had obtained either a nuclear weapon or the makings of a dirty bomb. And it was serious enough that the president dispatched a nuclear search team to the Gulf, not to Pakistan itself, alerted the Pakistanis, who went searching around but didn't want to say too much about what they found because they didn't want us to know too much about the locations of their own weapons. And people in the White House were pretty unimpressed with the technology that the Pakistanis had, even after all these years, in an American program that I described in The Inheritance to build up their capability. They were pretty unimpressed with what the technology was to go look for loose nuclear material. But that really impressed upon them that the threat to the United States is in Pakistan. It's really not in Afghanistan anymore. Now, while this was going on, you had two other big stories that were unfolding. One was the rise of China. And the fascinating thing about the president's engagement with China was that year one, when the financial crisis was at its worst, the president had thought that he could really sit down with the Chinese, deal with them as economic equals, the number one and number two economies of the world, and work together on bringing about the recovery, especially because the Europeans seemed a little bit paralyzed, though not as paralyzed as they've been in the past year or year and a half. And this worked pretty well, or it seemed to, until the White House discovered by early 2010 that what they had intended as engagement, the Chinese had interpreted as weakness. That what it meant was that the United States felt it couldn't make it without China's cooperation. And so you saw the Chinese begin to do these claims in the South China Sea. You saw them begin to step out much more assertively in making an effort to push the United States back behind the second island chain in the Pacific. And that's what led to the president's decision to try what has been called the pivot to Asia, or they called it the pivot briefly until the Europeans said, pivot away from what? So now it's the rebalancing. Doesn't that sound better? You also saw an effort to build up American forces even as we are building down elsewhere. And that is, in many ways, I think, going to be the bigger gamble of the Obama presidency, a much bigger gamble in some ways than going after bin Laden. And then you saw the reaction to the Arab Spring. And this took America by surprise, didn't entirely take President Obama by surprise. I tell the story in Confront and Conceal of how in the summer of 2010, just before he went off on summer vacation, this was just 2 summers ago, he signed a secret presidential study directive to try to get his White House staff to think about what would happen if a number of the Arab states collapsed. That was secret because you didn't want the Saudis picking up the New York Times and reading that there was a study underway in the White House discussing what was going to happen if their population finally began to go after the royal family. And same true for many other states within the Arab states. So they were a little better prepared than the intel community was when Tunisia blew up in January of December and January 2011. President Obama was being briefed one day, and he asked the question, so what are the chances that this uprising in Tunisia is going to spread to Egypt? Oh, very small, he was told. We've looked at this. We think, under 20%. And that was about 2 weeks before Tahrir Square. The conversation that took place a few weeks later between President Obama and Hosni Mubarak was, to my mind, one of the most remarkable, poignant moments in the Obama presidency that we've seen yet. And I had my hands on enough of a transcript of it that you'll see some of this in the book. But President Obama calls Mubarak after the president's own staff was quite divided about the degree to which we should help push Mubarak under the bus. Well, let me rephrase that. Mubarak put himself under the bus. The degree to which we should back the bus up and down over him a few times. And so the president reached Mubarak shortly after he had given a speech, just hours after he had given a speech in which he had been expected to resign and instead gave this very defiant account of how he was staying in power to save the country. And President Obama said, I respect my elders. You've been in office for 30 years since I was in college. And I wouldn't presume to tell you how to go run your country. But I think there's something going out in the streets that you've got to get out ahead of because this is not normal. And Mubarak said to him, I don't think you understand the situation, he said, give me 10 days. Nasser put one of these down. and I'll put it down as well, with code word for give me 10 days to shoot everybody you're seeing out there on CNN, and this whole problem will have gone away. Well, fortunately, the military had sided, Egyptian military, more with those on the street, and Mubarak's history is well known to you. When I got to Egypt last January, just this past January, with two of my research assistants, fortunately one of them speaks Arabic, which I don't, so I actually was able to make my way around and get out of the country again. What became clear to me was that the same revolutionaries who had been so effective on the streets were utterly clueless about how to get out, run for office, go do the things you need to do to build a state. And Hillary Clinton had discovered the same thing 6 months before when she visited Egypt and sat down with a number of these students and basically ended up lecturing them about how you put together a real campaign. And they sort of stared at her and said, we don't need to. We did our job, which was to get rid of the old regime. Well, I think what we've discovered in the last 48 hours is whatever happened to the old regime, it was not gotten rid of. Mubarak is gone, but everybody else is still there. And we're now in the beginnings of a very long process that Secretary Clinton and Bob Gates had warned the president might well be the outcome. In fact, Secretary Clinton said to the president, I think this will turn out in Egypt all right, but it may take 25 years. And that whole tension between younger members of the Obama administration who could see themselves out in Tahrir Square if they had been Egyptian, and people like Gates and Clinton who were fearful of getting rid of a government until you knew what followed. That was a fascinating tension that I think will probably get written about again and again and again. And I just want to finish with just a few lines about Olympic Games and then take your questions. Questions come up to me just 100 or 200 times in the past few weeks. So why is it that you felt compelled to write about a secret American program to destroy the Iranian nuclear program? And the first answer to that is, it may have been secret to us, but it wasn't secret to the Iranians. So the story of Olympic Games, for those of you who saw the Times excerpt or seen the account in the book, is that President Bush started a program, authorized a program to begin to get into these computer controllers. And it was a very complex effort because the U.S. had never tried this before. In fact, they built a replica of the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant spread over several of the U.S. National Energy Department laboratories, nuclear laboratories. They spread it out so that even the workers in the labs didn't fully understand what they were building and doing. We were fortunate in that A.Q. Khan had sold to Muammar Gaddafi a number of the same types of centrifuges that he had sold to the Iranians. And when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program in 2003, a move he came to regret last year, those centrifuges were moved to the United States. So the U.S. had a few around for what is delicately called destructive testing. They tested a similar computer worm in this test bed they made. It literally forced the centrifuges, which spin at supersonic speeds, to self-destruct, and some of the rubble from it was picked up and flown to Washington and dumped on the conference room table in the Situation Room for President Bush to look at. At that moment, he approved the program, and I hinted at this a little bit in the opening pages of The Inheritance 3.5 years ago, but I didn't understand the scope of it. And the program went on for 2 years, quite in secret. The Iranians knew that their centrifuges were failing, but they just thought that Khan had sold them a lousy design, which, by the way, he had. There's a reason the Pakistanis don't still use these centrifuges. But in 2010, an error was made. And the error was a programming mistake in one of the versions of the computer worm that was inserted into the Natanz plant. This is the same kind of mistake that leads Microsoft to send these patches out to your computer, so just when you need to print something out, you're told it will only be a half an hour before it reboots with the new fix. But in this particular case, the mistake meant that the worm that was operating inside Natanz leapt aboard the laptop computer of an Iranian scientist, probably unwitting, who had plugged into the computer system just to do maintenance work one day. He then packed up and went home, turned his computer on again, and the worm did not recognize that it had left Natanz and was now out amid the internet. And so when he turned his computer on and connected it into the internet, while he was watching whatever he was watching or playing whatever games he was playing, the worm that the United States and Israel had spent so many years developing, or at least a version of it, spread out across the world. There were millions of copies in Iran, in Indonesia, ultimately here. And they were detected very quickly by computer experts who dissected it, gave it a name, Stuxnet. The U.S. government had never called it Stuxnet and still hasn't to this day. And the Iranians, when they got a look at this, realized that somebody had designed probably the world's most sophisticated computer weapon and aimed it at their plant, and it was designed specifically to bring down centrifuges. And at the time, they named their suspects for who had done this in 2010. And Switzerland was not on the list. Okay. We wrote a big story in early 2011 that said that this had been an Israeli and U.S. operation. There was not a presidential election on at the time, and there was absolutely no controversy about the piece. Now, when I came back and pulled on that string as I began working on this book, and traveled around the world and tried to build up from the bottom up what had happened here, I was able to fill in a lot more of the details, and you'll read in the account of it, including discussions of what happened when Leon Panetta and two of his aides had to go down in the Situation Room in 2010 and explain to the president that Stuxnet had gotten out, this worm had been released, and they had to make a decision about whether to kill the program. The president decided not to kill the program, and instead concluded the Iranians probably hadn't figured out what was going on yet. They kept at it with two new versions of it, and the second of those new versions brought down about 1,000 of the centrifuges. Now, this set the Iranians back. By how much is a question of big debate. Some people say 18 months to 2 years. Others say that that's a U.S. government estimate and it's overly aggressive. But in any case, it did set them back. And it also proved to the Iranians that while the negotiations are underway and while the sanctions are underway, the U.S. has some other means of slowing them down. Now, I didn't print this stuff just blindly. The Times, when we have issues of national security at hand, always is careful to go to very senior government officials with knowledge of it, as we did in the case of WikiLeaks. Case of WikiLeaks, we actually showed them the cables we were planning to write from, said if you're going to raise any issues about them, please raise them now. And they did, and we made deletions. It's reasonable to assume the same thing happened in this case as it happens in almost all national security cases. Because we recognize that while you want to be able to tell the story of what the government is doing in your name, we don't want to interrupt ongoing operations, put lives in danger. So I think we struck the right balance. There are clearly many in Congress who don't share my view on that issue. But I think that the issue that we're debating right now and beginning to debate, which is this a direction we want the United States to go as we enter this brave new world, I think that's an important debate to have. Well, I've droned on for too long, but I figure it's the last time Marshall has me out here. What can he do, disinvite me? So I look forward to your questions, and I thank you very much for having me back here in Chicago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanger. Now we'd like to go out to the audience for questions. If you could raise your hand and wait for the mic. And yeah, we'll start right in the back there with, I think, Phil Hummer. Thanks.
If we were successful with working with Israel in that computer warfare, how is it that the administration has done so poorly in working with Israel on the other issues, such
settlements, Palestinians, so forth. Very good question. It's the difference between how intelligence agencies work together and how militaries sometimes work together and how politicians work together. And in the case of Olympic Games, the program really had two major objectives. One was obviously to slow the Iranians. The other was to prove to the Israelis that there was an alternative to bombing Natanz that might get the same delay, but might not bring about a huge counter-reaction, the reaction we all fear if indeed the Israelis decide at some point that they are going to take military action. And the Israelis were willing to go along with that and try the experiment. Now, they've always reserved the right to go out and use military force if they wanted to, but I think the president thought he was buying some time, and he and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and before that, Prime Minister Olmert before that, they all seemed to recognize that this was at least worth trying.
Okay, right here, Avi Porat, please.
Can you talk for a minute about the role of Russia in all of that? When you watch the videos this morning from Carbos, it looks like we're back in the Cold War, the way the two of them talk to each other, Putin and Obama. What do you see the role of Russia as we go forward?
A very good question. The reset was a great idea that didn't work. I mean, it started off in a very good direction, and I think when the president went and decided to undo the missile defense program that President Bush had put together and used something that would be deployed earlier and was a lot more flexible out in the seas, the Russians initially went along with it. But over time, I think the Russians grew to be concerned about several things. The first was that they believed ultimately that President Obama was quite determined to isolate them from rising again as a new force within the Middle East and elsewhere. So you have seen this conflict over Syria. You saw it before in Libya, where the Russians went along reluctantly with a resolution to intervene on a humanitarian basis in Libya, and then felt as if the president and NATO countries had deceived them and used it as an opportunity to drive Gaddafi from power. They have vowed not to allow that to happen again. And of course, you have President Putin just now coming back in, eager to show that he's going to put together some spine that he did not believe Medvedev, his appointed successor and predecessor, ever demonstrated. And so you're caught to some degree in the problem of Putin demonstrating that his vision of a strong Russia can prevail, and feeling as if he's got to go in a very muscular way directly up against the president. It's pretty fascinating because when you think about it, Medvedev went to all these previous summits. So President Obama and President Putin have very little experience with each other. And I think that President Obama found Medvedev somebody he could pretty well deal with, and I think that he's discovering that Putin is just as advertised.
Right up here in the front row, please. One second, the microphone's coming.
I'd like to first thank you for the wonderful speech you gave. My question regards Egypt and the military and the latest steps they've taken. You kind of had a negative connotation towards these actions, but what do you think about the counter-argument as to the fact that maybe these steps can cause more of a balance in the parliament, and that many liberals and other Egyptians are, they kind of have an optimistic view towards these latest steps, especially if you look at the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood only had about 27% of the total votes, and that showed, and they had a domination in the parliament. So,
Sure.
What do you think about that?
Well, we haven't seen a final, at least I haven't seen a final vote count, or certainly one that we can trust yet, and we may never see one we can trust on the presidential vote. But certainly it's the case that the Muslim Brotherhood got about 47% in the parliament, and the Salafists, who are significantly more conservative Islamists, got another 25%. So that was pretty overwhelming. And, you know, I think back to what a very senior American official said to me back in December when it was pretty unclear. The parliamentary election just happened, and it was pretty unclear how this was going to sort out. This official said, you know, if I go back there at the end of 2012 and I'm sitting opposite a bunch of generals, we will have failed because there'll just be Mubarakism without Mubarak. If I'm sitting opposite a bunch of fundamentalists who are closing down the bars in the Western hotels and, you know, banning bikinis on the beaches and then beginning to put women back in veils and so forth, then we would have failed in the other direction. And if what we get is a big muddle in which no one's quite sure who's running the country, that may be the best we can hope for. That may be the best. What worries me about the sort of soft coup we've seen in the past few days is that it could be that when the U.S. goes back, it's just sitting opposite a group of generals. That if this parliament is not seated, then you've essentially got a return to Mubarak's era. And that's, I think, the big concern.
Okay, thanks. Another question? There was an, right here, please. Thanks. One second, the mic's coming.
President Obama, in general, at least from the different parties, is criticized for his softness in dealing with other countries. So what do you think will happen if a Republican president comes? How much these policies will change?
Well, when you hear the softness argument, it's sort of a question of where one is seeing this. So maybe with Russia, to go with your question, maybe that may be an example of an area where the president's engagement policies allowed a moment for the Russians to sort of push back harder than they expected. In China, as I suggested before, I think they started off pretty soft, but they've adjusted. In Iran, which is the area where you've heard Governor Romney talk about softness and a very soft approach, I haven't heard him repeat that phrase since the wider public has learned about Olympic Games. I mean, you know, the combination of sanctions that are significantly stronger than what the Bush administration did, which I think members of the Bush administration would themselves admit, they just say the Europeans weren't ready for it in their time, a stepped-up covert program. Those two don't sound to me like it's been especially soft, and the Iranians certainly don't seem to think it's been especially soft. Now, the other question is, will it prove to have been effective? Because it's very possible that the Iranian reaction to both the sanctions and the covert program is just to double down on their program and bring it further underground. And, you know, we'll know a little more about that, I think, in a day or two when we see whether these Moscow round of talks are more like the first set of talks, which seemed pretty positive, or more like the second, which seemed stuck in the water.
Okay. Right here, please. Timur Guk.
Hi. Now, the administration and others realize the relationship with Pakistan, but where does the administration stand in relation to Saudi Arabia? Presumably, the Saudis approved the drone strikes, etc., but on the other hand, they also presumably are behind a lot of the elections that followed the Arab Spring. So is there any concern about that?
There certainly is, and I mentioned that moment where the president was on the phone with Mubarak. And what's fascinating is that at the same time, the Saudis were on the phone with President Obama, and they were saying, whatever you do, you have to support Mubarak, even if he goes out and shoots people in the streets. Because they were looking at what was going on and thinking about themselves and thinking about their own fragile leadership, more fragile since the death of Prince Nayef over the weekend. It was, of course, the second crown prince they've run through in less than a year. So there's, a fair bit of turmoil just within the family about what's going to come up next. The president went out and gave a rousing speech in May, I think this was right, May of 2011, supporting democracy in the Arab Spring, and built into it a very small caveat, which you had to go read the speech twice in order to go see. But he said, there will be moments when our interests will have to trump our values in pushing for democracy. And what he was speaking to was Saudi Arabia, which he never mentioned in the speech, and Bahrain, where, of course, the Saudis sent troops right across the causeway into Bahrain, and the administration said almost nothing about it. They issued a press release on a Friday night saying, we really wish you hadn't done this. And that was about the last time they ever spoke about it. So the Saudis put the U.S.'s principles really on the test here. And the question is, if the Arab Spring ever actually spread to Saudi Arabia, how would the administration react? And I'm not sure I came away from this whole process with a firm sense of that.
Yeah, right here, please.
Thank you for your appearance tonight. Very insightful. Given the level of pessimism I think many people share with respect to the upcoming summit with Iran, assuming pessimism is justified, what do you think the likely outcome would be? What do you think will happen if you could, if you had a crystal ball?
If I could predict world events, particularly in places where the oil markets are very sensitive to it, I could probably be making a lot more money than I am in journalism, don't you think? That said, let me give you sort of a range of options. So let's assume for a moment that the Iranians decide they're going to try to buy for some more time. They may well be calculating that the Supreme Leader and President Obama have a common interest for the next couple of months, which is that neither one of them wants to see a big disruption in the Middle East. The President, for obvious reasons, a huge spike in oil prices at this moment between now and November would not exactly be helpful, and the Iranians are looking for a way to avoid getting bombed and relief from the sanctions. So then the calculus comes down entirely to the Israelis. And come September or October, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have a big decision to make. If he thinks that Mitt Romney is more likely than not to get elected president, I think he might well determine he can hold back some time, that Romney would be more likely either to join in an attack on Iran, based on his public statements that, if need be, he would take military action, or that he would be less likely to be critical after the election of the Israelis if they decided to go do it alone. If he concluded that President Obama was going to get reelected, he might well come to the conclusion, and this is all mights and woulds and ifs, might well come to the conclusion that if Israel's going to move, it's better that they move prior to the election, that the U.S. ability to condemn the action would be quite constrained prior to the election, but might be greater thereafter. But this is just sort of looking at the three-dimensional chessboard and trying to guess out how projections of these come together. And then there's also just the question of where the estimates are on how close the Iranians are to actually getting either a weapon or a weapons capability. And remember here that while those two sound the same, they're actually quite different. President Obama has been very clear that he does not believe you could contain an Iran with a nuclear weapon. But he has not expressed an opinion, at least that I've heard, about whether he could contain an Iran that builds right up to the line and could assemble a weapon fairly quickly, but doesn't quite have one. And when I asked him in an interview about a year and a half or 2 years ago, he said, I'm not going to parse that for you, and he hasn't since. So it is very possible that the U.S. and Israel together may come to some common conclusion that Iran can be allowed some more time between now and then. And the issue is, do the Israelis measure time the same way the U.S. does? The U.S. feels like it has more time because it has more capability if it decides it needs to take military action. The Israelis feel like they've got nothing that could get inside that big underground site at Fordo where the Iranians are building their next enrichment plant. I did indeed, and I saw him in Washington last week when he was collecting the Medal of Honor. The interesting question is, does Shimon Peres get a vote in this one? And I'm not sure the answer to that. The big question is, who beyond Defense Minister Barak and Prime Minister Netanyahu actually are going to, in the end, be the ones making the decision?
Yeah, right here, please, in the fourth row from the back. The mic's coming that way.
I've heard the relationship with Pakistan get described as a dysfunctional marriage. Given what you just mentioned about Saudi Arabia, would you say that it's starting to head in that direction, or is it not quite there yet?
Well, to say that the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan is like a dysfunctional marriage is actually, I think, to sort of underrate dysfunctional marriages. I mean, we're in a situation here with a country that is called a major non-NATO ally, still listed as one, that has blocked our ability to go provide food up through their routes for the troops in Afghanistan for many months now. And much of the Pakistan section of Confront and Conceal takes you through what happened after the bin Laden raid and how we we knew this would be bad, but we had no idea how bad. With the Saudis, I don't think that we're any place close to that, because I think that the Saudis have a much more rational calculus of where their national interest lies, and they don't act as if they have to worry about public opinion, whereas in Pakistan, where President Obama's approval ratings in the latest Pew poll were about 7%, you turn on the TV every night and you hear these diatribes against the United States. You don't hear that in Saudi Arabia, and you don't because it's a very controlled media environment in part.
Okay. Yeah, right here, please, Shendel Marcus.
What is your take on the Khamenei's statement that nuclear weapons are anti-Islamic?
The question was, what do we make of the many statements and written statements that the Supreme Leader has turned out saying that building a nuclear weapon would be anti-Islamic? President Obama has sort of leaned on these in writing letters back to the Supreme Leader in saying, you know, I'm building on your very own statements. You've said this yourself, so all you need to do now is reassure the world community that, in fact, what you're doing is not intended to build a weapon or the weapon's capability I described before. And then we could see our way toward a normal relationship, and the President has not even, at least prior to the election year, ruled out the possibility that Iran could go out and produce its own nuclear fuel under the right kind of very strict inspection. But so far, when you go back and you look at what Iran's record has been in answering the questions that the international inspectors have raised, you know, please explain this document that shows two hemispheres that look a lot like trying to put together the parts of a nuclear bomb. Please explain this video that looks like a re-entry vehicle that would detonate at about 600 meters, which is about the height at which we detonated the Hiroshima bomb, and so forth. They just haven't come back with those answers. And so the big question for President Obama is, if this negotiation is successful, and we all hope it certainly is, how quickly would the Iranians have to go provide these kinds of assurances? And I think that's where the real rubber is going to meet the road here, because there are going to be a lot of people questioning whether the Iranians are simply playing for time, or whether they sincerely have decided now that the sanctions hurt so much that they really need to change strategy. And so far, we just don't see the evidence yet that they've decided to change strategy. Might come.
Oh, yeah, the woman right there with the glasses, please.
Since drones are the new weapons being used, how long do you think one of them will be used against our country by our enemies to attack our leaders?
When drones would be used to come in? Well, certainly it could happen. I mean, you could launch one from Canada or you could launch one from Mexico, but you'd need a base in which to do these. And, you know, the thing about drones is that while they look small and, you know, you're thinking the radio-controlled airplanes that you played with as a kid, in fact, they require a huge amount of infrastructure just to keep them up and flying. And the base at Bagram, where a lot of these fly out of, is enormous. Because remember, they're keeping these things on patrol basically 24 hours a day, and the kind of technical troubles you can run into them are significant. It's not an expensive program, but they're significant. So this is an area where the U.S. is saved in large part by the fact that we're so far away from so many other nations, and they don't have a platform necessarily to go launch them from. But it'll happen one day. My own personal prediction, I said to you before I wouldn't make any, but I'll make one here. It's a lot easier to get a cyber attack across American borders than to get a drone across American borders. It happens every single day, mostly to corporate America. So my suspicion is that you're going to see a lot more of that before you have to worry about the drones.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for. Please join me in thanking Mr. Sanger tonight.